So what was the thesis of the reading? What was talked about in your groups as it pertains to the thesis?
In regards to the thesis, I put the main argument of the reading is that Harriet Tubman is not accurately represented in historical literature, and not not she's not talked about much today as she should be.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else on that thesis? Pablo, what did you all discuss as your thesis for the reading?
Yeah, I was talking about a different reading because I actually mixed it up and I thought we were on week 6, so I watched the videos and I didn't actually read the.
Okay, but you were in a breakout group, correct? So what did you all talk about in the breakout group as far as the thesis?
I didn't really catch the thesis, but for the other parts, they were talking about how one. Oh, can I answer the next question, or do I have to answer the thesis?
Mm-hmm.
Something they said that stood out to them from the reading was that they learned that Harriet Tubman was the starter of the Underground Railroads.
So they didn't know that Harriet Tubman ran the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, one of them said that.
Okay. Russell, what did you have for the thesis in your breakout groups?
I said that the thesis was the bigger legacy that Harriet Tubman left behind that is untold by other people.
Perfect, thank you. All right. What are some of the things that stood out to you in regards to the reading? Anyone, what stood out to you in regards to the reading? Go ahead, Bobina.
What stood out to me about the reading was so it was mentioned that there was a sex tape that was leaked. It wasn't even actually that, it was just people acting. And that just made me really upset because I feel like it really reduced everything that Harriet Tubman, or it was an attempt, it didn't reduce it. It was an attempt to reduce everything that Harriet Tubman had done. It was an attempt to kind of depict her as being manipulative and animalistic in the way of using her body to gain an advantage rather than the fact that she just had an advantage naturally through her knowledge of I believe it was astronomy. And I just feel like it just goes back to the whole, depicting Black people or African people as being animalistic to reduce their achievements. And that just really upset me, that I feel, especially with women, people can't really digest them doing something impressive without thinking that there needs to be sex somehow related or intertwined into that.
Perfect, good call out, thank you. Anyone else want to speak to what stood out to them or new understandings about Harriet Tubman that they did not have at first? So you could talk about question 2 or question 3. Go ahead, Ulysses.
Actually, so like when I was reading it, it said that she had like a disability. I just wanted to clarify real quick because I'm not sure, because when I used to read it about Harriet Tubman, it said that she had like a brain tumor, and like that's what led her to like the Underground Railroad to get through and stuff. But like, was that the reason for her disability, or like was it a different disability that she had?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the brain tumor, Ulysses. Yeah, that's news to me. The discipline that I had been aware with, she was hit in the head on an attempt to escape, and it gave her a very, very bad gash that impaired her sight. That's the disability that I was familiar with. I'm not saying that she didn't have a brain tumor. I'm just saying that I'm just not familiar with that, right?
Oh yeah, I think it was something. It was like something along that line. I just assumed it was a. I think like past teachers probably said it was a brain tumor, but I mean, they say whatever now. So
That's true too. You're right about that. Yeah, ain't no telling. Okay. Anyone else want to speak to something that stood out or just new understanding that they had before I jump into my notes? All right. So before I get into my notes, I want to kind of provide a framework for how I'm thinking about Harriet Tubman, and I want you all to be attentive to these theoretical frames. The first one that we're going to deal with is called fugitivity. Fugitivity. Now, fugitivity is centered on the plantation society, but it has reverberations in our contemporary society, right? In the plantation society, when one is property of the plantation owner, right? And that individual decides to free his or herself from that plantation, they become a fugitive, right? It's the idea of stealing yourself from the plantation owner and trying to navigate yourself to freedom. Now, what's important about fugitivity, once you are able to get off the plantation, that does not mean that your escape is complete, right? Because as we should know, once you get off the plantation, they're sending the slave catchers after you and they're sending the hounds after you. So acts of fugitivity would be things like making sure that you navigate into the water so that way your scent can't be traced by the dogs. Acts of fugitivity is things like making sure that your footsteps are covered so that way the catchers can't trace your footsteps. Has anybody heard of the food hush puppies? So hush puppies are an act of fugitivity. If you come across a dog who's going to bark, you would feed them some hush puppies so they could be quiet, right? So again, it's the act of stealing yourself, but remaining in constant flight because you know until you get to that destination, which is freedom, which is the North, you are still a fugitive. Now, what's also important to know is that the notion of fugitivity is closely and intimately tied to policing. Why would I say that fugitivity is closely and intimately tied to policing? I'll give you a hint. Where is the one place in the United States where enslavement is still legal?
Nowhere.
No. Where's the one place? So somewhere, go ahead, God, thank you.
In the prison system.
Absolutely. Check your 14th Amendment. Someone is free until they begin to get into the confines of the prison system. Now, let me ask you, who places you in prison? What government-sponsored agency is typically responsible for placing people in prison? No one? Go ahead, Mashara, thank you.
The police.
So what I'm getting to, the origins of policing, the original inception for policing is to take those who engage in the act of fugitivity back to the plantation. There was no police system, there was no police force until African people sought to free themselves from the plantation. The plantation hasn't gone away, it has evolved into the prison system. The slave catcher hasn't gone away, he just dons blue uniform. The slave catching dog has not gone away, they're just now called canine. So this is what I mean when I say that fugitivity is intimately tied to our modern day conceptions of policing. So it should not surprise you who makes up the prison population. So that's the first theoretical frame, fugitivity, the act of stealing oneself and remaining in constant flight. Now, the second theoretical frame is intersectionality. Is anyone familiar with the term intersectionality? So intersectionality stems from your positionality. So for myself, my positionality, I occupy the position of a black individual, a male, right? I'm a black male who is heteronormative, right? I'm a black male who's heteronormative, who is middle class, if that is a thing, right? So these positions that I occupy make up my positionality. Now, intersectionality deals with those positions, but how they respond to axis of oppression. So again, I'm black, right? So from the standpoint of race, I operate at the lower end of this form of oppression. So I could be oppressed because I'm black in an anti-black society. I'm a man. So in this particular realm, I'm on the upper end of things, unfortunately, because we exist within a patriarchal society, right? I'm heteronormative, so at this standpoint of things, I'm on the upper end of things because we are existing in a heteronormative society. I'm not Christian, right? So from that standpoint, I operate on the lower things of society because this is a Protestant or a Christian society. So you see how your position maintains your intersection, which determines how you are being responded to these forms of oppression. So if you're a black woman, you're on the both lower ends of the racial aspect of oppression and the gender realm of oppression, right? If you're a black woman who is homosexual, right? Who is poor and non-Christian, then you operate at every aspect under the normative realm of society. So this is where Harriet Tubman and her work and her activism becomes profoundly important because she is one of the first individuals to organize and produce activist work from a standpoint of intersectionality. It says, the opening page, she's often described as an illiterate woman who could neither read nor write. However, her abilities to read the world, from curing sickness with her knowledge of herbal medicine to navigating the natural terrain via the night sky through her knowledge of astronomy, remain key in escaping and rescuing others from enslavement. So it's this notion of her being illiterate, but at the same time, her having a form of literacy that goes far beyond the normative understandings or interpretations of literacy. And for me, when I read this, I thought back to week 1, right? When we learned about the Dogon and the Dogon's ability to climb up on a mountain and with their naked eye see Sirius star A and Sirius star B without technology. It makes me think back to week 1 when we learned about how the ancient Kemetics were able to build the pyramids in alignment with the star systems. So yes, this is outstanding that she had this capacity to read and to be in tune with nature. But for me, it's not so astounding because I know as African people, this is something that we always done. But this notion of her being illiterate, we must also contextualize that. Was she not a formerly enslaved individual who escaped? So as a formerly enslaved individual, her capacity to obtain literacy is vastly impacted. Because you do know if you get caught with a piece of paper in your hand in a plantation society, you will lose that hand. You do know to read would be outlawed. I'll give you an example of a story from a book I've read called School Clothes, written by Jarvis Gibbons. And he tells the stories of Papa Dallas. And Papa Dallas got caught trying to read twice. And so what the enslaver did to Papa Dallas was pour acid in his eyes to ensure that he would never read again. But more importantly, the others on the plantation would see his eyes being badly damaged, and they would know to never read again. So when we talk about Harriet Tubman being illiterate, we must understand the context and the situation that produced her illiteracy, but also give reverence to the fact that she had a form of literacy that goes beyond just books. On page 3, it states that Tubman's role reached far beyond her most famous one as a conductor of the Underground Railroad. Underground Road. When she made 13 trips to the South and rescued approximately 70 enslaved from the plantation, according to the most recent biographies. She is also a Civil War nurse, veteran, community organizer, women's suffrage, and border crossing migrant. The latter role explored by Danny J. Boyd in this issue. So again, let's kind of keep it where it's at, right? 13 trips from the South to the North, 13, freeing 70 people. And she most famously said, I could have freed more people if they knew that they were enslaved. Think about that. I could have freed more if they knew they were enslaved. So essentially what she's saying is, yo, I came to folks to offer them freedom. Like, yo, I'm headed north, roll with me. Nah, I'm good. I'm gonna sit here and pick this cotton. This is what she says prevented her from freeing more people. But this notion of her being a border crossing migrant, and for those who are into politics, we know we're in an election year, and right now, because of us being an election year, the border is a hot political topic, right? If Biden wins, what will he do about the migrants crossing the border? If Trump wins, what will he do about migrants crossing the border, right? But what the article is telling us is Tubman was in the business of crossing these borders long before, taking people from the southern states into the northern states into Canada, right? So she crossed that border to traverse herself into Canada, and the author is pointing to the fact that she not only did these things from the capacity of the Underground Railroad, but she traversed borders, right? On page 4, it says that, looking at the third paragraph, of course, Tubman herself contributed to this larger than life portrait. After attending the NACW convention, Tubman later went on to a women's suffrage meeting in Rochester, New York in November of 1896. Led on stage by Susan B. Anthony, the elderly Tubman declared to another appreciative audience how I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years. And I can say what most conductors cannot say, I have never ran my train off track, and I have never lost a passenger. So again, 8 years, over 13 trips, 70 people, and not lost one of them. 8 years, almost a decade, over a dozen trips from the South to Canada. 70 people rescued and did not lose one. And I get that she was so much more than just an Underground Railroad, granted, but we can't diminish the profound, miraculous brilliance in the work of the Underground Railroad. 13 trips. So check it, it's like she got herself free. That alone is miraculous. And she said, my family's still there. I'm gonna go back and get my family. Gets them free. That ain't enough. I still know people who are suffering the system of enslavement. Let me go back and get them free. So again, it's not about the individual. It wasn't just about Harriet and her loved ones. It was about the collective will of the whole, making sure all African peoples who experienced this had an opportunity to experience freedom. In crafting a narrative emphasizing her role as an Underground Railroad conductor, Tubman validated the struggle for women's rights. Moreover, Tubman's story reminded women that if she, a woman, could transgress the race and gender limitations that forbade women from navigating the world and freely crossing the borders between North and South, Canada and the United States, and two, to do so without a man's help. If she, a woman, could lead a successful battle during the Civil War, then surely women deserve the right to vote and the rights to full citizenship. Such a complex history seamlessly weaves women's rights and the rights of African Americans. So what she was doing was using her life as an example to argue for the rights of women. But like let's unpack this, right? 13 trips, 10 years, 70 people. At a time where African people couldn't really just travel on their own. It would be looked at suspiciously to see just some Black folks traveling, right? At a time that not only could Black folks not travel on their own, women could not travel on their own. So not if you've just seen a Black woman walking that looks suspicious, but if you see a woman, period, walking, that's suspicious. So here she is, a woman and a Black woman at that, navigating the South, navigating the North, all the way into Canada. And she says like, yo, if I could do this, if I could do these things, if I could lead a group into war during the Civil War, then there's no limitation to what women can do. Shit, if I could lead a group into battle, then damn sure I got the right to vote. This is the argument that she's making based on the life that she lived. And she's not claiming just for Black women, she's claiming for all women. This is what women could do. Yeah. That's kind of, we talked about that too. Yeah, I'm not really interested in the well, I do. I'll touch on this. I'll touch on this because I think this is important. It mentions the Combahee River Collective, and this is on page 7. It says, in reacting to the Combahee River Collective raid, while also paying homage to the Black feminist work of the Combahee River Collective, Gum's Rights, the miracle of our existence and our presence together is at the moment is something that has strengthened my faith in community and freedom forever. Why I bring up the Combahee River Collective and through the work of Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Within the Combahee River Collective, we have a distinction between normative mainstream feminism and the way that, let's call it what it is, the way that white women practice feminism. And within the Combahee River Collective, you have an example of how African women seek to practice feminism. And I'll put this in my words, and there's several research and there's several literature that could look into to support my claim. But to put it bluntly, right, the way that white women or mainstream feminist women look at feminism is to replace the man as the power structure. So it's not about creating a society that's equal. We know that men are in power. We don't like that men are in power. So what we want to do is to be the ones in power. This is a critique of mainstream white feminism, right? And in doing so, you oftentimes leave the concerns of non-white women out of the conversation. So when you look at movements like the Combahee River Collective, they're not looking to usurp men as the power. They're looking to create a society that's equal. And in doing so, they realize that Black men also must be politicized, must be also heighten their level of consciousness so they can recognize their roles as oppressors. So they recognize that the role of patriarchy also does not serve them. This is vastly different from how mainstream feminism talks about men. So it's important to understand the distinction between mainstream feminism and what some may call, I'm thinking about Alice Walker in the early 1980s, what she calls Black womanism. Black womanism does not leave the Black men out of the conversation. Black womanism does not seek to replace white men as an axis of power. Black womanism seeks to create an egalitarian, equal society that provides resources and access to all. Harriet Tubman was a Black feminist, Black womanist. Harriet Tubman offers a critique against mainstream white feminism. And this is why this notion of intersectionality, being able to identify the multiple modes of positionality and how they intersect with these notions of oppression becomes important. Because I, as a Black man, could talk about ending racism all day. But if I don't talk about ending patriarchy and misogyny against women, then it's an incomplete revolution. I'll end there. We'll open up the space for Fishbowl. You have twice per semester. You have one time to pass. You could talk about my notes. You could talk about the reading. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout groups, or you could read from your journal. Does anyone volunteer to Fishbowl or want to volunteer? All right. Glorian, we got you. Anyone else? If not, I'll just start calling at random. All right. Jessica, are you prepared to Fishbowl?
Yes.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you. And we'll get one more. Jose, are you prepared to Fishbowl?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll go in that order. We'll go Glorian, Jessica, and Jose. Glorian, you're up first.
Okay. For me, in my journal, I kind of talked about like my main points were how they kind of reference her as a footnote and then how they described her as illiterate. To me, it's kind of like, although like she was described as that, that's not who she was. She was able to accomplish like a lot of things that even doing so, like it could have resulted in her dying literally, like because she escaped and just her helping other slaves as well. It was just, to me, her bravery is what stood out because realistically, like I said, at any given moment, she could have been killed for doing what she was doing. I also talked about how one of my classmates also talked about the sex tape. That also stood out to me because I feel like I'm honestly not surprised by it because even now in today's world, a lot of women who tend to be powerful or influential are kind of degraded and frowned upon. And a lot of it is from men feeling threatened by them and their way of, I guess, kind of like hurting women in a sense is by saying that by creating these sex tapes or trying to find things that degrade them in a way that isn't necessarily true. Or I'd like to say that not only speaking from experience, but I feel like a lot of women can relate to when men, not only men, but women as well, will say like, oh, sometimes women are showing too much skin. And then that it's kind of like there's confident women that are just confident in themselves that they should feel free to do whatever they want. So that kind of relates back to why would you create a sex tape, although she's done so many things that has helped a lot of people. But to me, obviously I took it as a way of they felt threatened by her. And it was clear because she was able to go around the usual track and free so many people that I feel like is not really talked about enough as well. But overall, like the reading in itself, I learned a lot more about her in a
deeper sense, because there was a lot of points that I didn't necessarily know, but it was cool to see that she not only was able to just push past the things that things were put toward on her, but she was just taking her bravery and just committed to helping everyone else in that. So yeah.
Thank you. Jessica?
So basically, um, well, basically, from what I learned from the text is how much respect that they put her name. Like how much there's so many things that I didn't know before, like how she helped in the Civil War, and how she, how she was like a veteran, a nurse. I just feel like so many like they never teach me this in like my history class. So like this is like all new information for me. So I feel like they should teach like kids this like in middle school and high school, so, so they could like really understand um how how she bent like so they could really understand um how an amazing person she was. Also what you mentioned before, I didn't really about white feminism and black um womanism.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't like right now I didn't think of that right now. So you're right. I about how like white women seek to like take over the man's position. Like they wanna like take over the position, but they don't seek for equality. So that's basically it.
Thank you, Jessica. Jose?
Yeah, my main like points throughout the reading, right? Like what I wrote down was that many things I learned from her were like from high school, right? But like she wasn't really talked about all that much, right? Like just a few like main ideas was that she like helped many people throughout her lifetime, right? But like thanks to the reading, it made me like oversee things, not oversee, but like over like rethink things that like I have thought. Like for example, like throughout the many other articles I read, right, made her seem like she wasn't all that big of a deal, right? Like, but this reading made her like stand out more. Made her like point out many important things that she has done throughout her life. And that's kind of mostly about what I wrote.
Cool. Thank you, Jose. Um, I'm thinking about what Gloria mentioned, and this notion of men being threatened by her, and the need to devalue her works by over sexualizing her. What for me, what I thought about when I read about the sex tape, and then I've actually seen the little skit that they put up on YouTube in regards to that. But what it brought to my attention is this notion of consent, right? And this idea of consent within the plantation society. There is no consent for someone who is enslaved. Any form of sexual relation between the slave owner and the enslaved is rape. There's no other way to classify that or think about it, right? They talk about the secret relationship between Thomas Jefferson and the enslaved women that he impregnated. Nah, call it what it is. He raped them. No secret relationship. Due to the nature of the exchange, that's rape. They don't have the power to say no. Do you think they would rather not be with their husbands than having to reduce their body to be of service to the individual who so-called own them? So to make light of this moment, or to make light of her ability to use her agency to free people, no, absolutely not. How could you do that when you're being raped? Just call it what it is, right? And I do think that this stems from, put it to you this way. You won't see a video of Martin Luther King talked about in this fashion. You won't see a video of Malcolm X talked about in this fashion. The only people who will be subjected to this type of humor, if you will, are Black women. And that's because of the axis of oppression that I was talking about when I was speaking in regards to intersectionality. Because they're not only oppressed by the status of them being Black, but they're also oppressed by the status of them being women. Because unfortunately, the people who put this tape together were Black men. So again, this can only happen to this one group of people. And to Lorian's point, this can only be done by someone with a very fragile and bruised ego. Period. So ideas like intersectionality become important, but again, notions like Black feminism become important because we can't afford as Black people to get into the conversations of, oh, we don't need our men and we don't need our women. We don't have that luxury. The reason we were able to survive the plantation, because we had each other. The reason we were able to survive Jim Crow, because we had each other. Reason why we're able to survive segregation, the crack epidemic, all of these things, because we had each other. Now, all the conversation is about how one doesn't need the other. So then for me, the question becomes, well, how will we survive? Think about this. State of California, Southern California specifically. Black folks are 6% of the population in Southern California. This is including like Black men, Black women, Black children, right? So we say 6% within these three groups. Let's just say 2% of that population are Black men. We make up over 60% of the incarcerated population, Black men, okay? Of the homeless population in Southern California, Black men make up 80% of that population. Okay? So with that onslaught taking place, this is why I say we can't afford conversations around how we don't need each other. We need each other now more than ever. But not understanding things like intersectionality, not understanding things like axes of power presents the opportunity for Black men to produce bullshit like this so-called sexting. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
I'll be honest, I did look up the lady who played Harriet Tubman, and I was very disappointed to see that she was also a Black woman, because I just feel like she also had a pretty fragile ego, down to the point where she had to put shame on Harriet Tubman's name to kind of reduce what she did, like the good things that she did. And I don't know, that just really made me upset.
Yeah. And I think too, Belvina, like, we have to take into account the society that we're in, right? We're in a likes-driven society. Everybody want to get that double tap. So you're willing to defile yourself and defile others just for the sake of the double tap, right? So at that capacity, nothing's off the table, you know? Other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Russell, what you thinking? You're unmuted, but I can't hear you, Russell.
Oh,
There you go.
can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh. I think it sucks that they're hiding her bigger legacy that she left behind, and they don't show it. Rather, they just choose a side that would like make her look in a worse spot.
Sophia, what you thinking?
In my group, we really just talked about the sexualization of everything and how it kind of dwindles into our society's stereotypes today. So I think that now a lot of the times in our society, we're kind of feeding into the rooted sexualization that first started on the plantations. And there's like a lot of common terminology now in our generation that we use that's just thrown around that has like roots back to plantations. So like my example was like in the gay community, we say stud. We refer to stud as a masculine Black woman, but the root of the word stems from a stud on the plantation, meaning the Black pure masculine man that they would use to produce offspring, babies. Like they would just exploit him. And now that I've learned about that word, like obviously I'm not going to use it anymore. And I think it's just degrading how it's really common now, especially in that community, like in the gay community. And I think that it goes for a lot of other common terms, you know.
Sophia, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't stud exclusively applied to Black women in that community?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another layer of irony to me also, right? Like out of all the people who occupy that position in that community, only the Black women is referred to as a stud, right? You mentioned that this sexualization process starts on the plantation. It actually goes back further than that. And I'm going to close with this. 2 years ago in the fall, I had the privilege to go to Ghana, go to Africa for the first time. And on this trip to Africa, one of the first things that we visited were the dungeons where they kept the enslaved. The last dungeon that was visited were the dungeon for the women who refused to consent to rape. And what I noticed while I was on the tour of the dungeon, there were cannons lined up along the castle facing the coast. But randomly throughout the castle, there were cannonballs everywhere. But especially in this particular dungeon that we visited where the women who refused to consent to rape were held, there were hella cannonballs there. And the tour guide proceeds to tell us the purpose for those cannonballs. So when a woman refused to be raped, they would place her in the dungeon and they would tell her to take this cannonball, about 25 to 50 pounds, and hold it above her head. And for as long as she could hold that cannonball above her head, she has refused to consent to rape. But the moment that that cannonball drops below her head, she has now made herself available to rape. And the tour guide tells us that this was the first lesson that the enslaver taught the African women. You have no choice but to consent. So this process started way before the plantation. And this is why I say this notion of consent within that parameter, within that dynamic, it's a misnomer. There is no consent. It's physically impossible to hold 50 pounds above your head forever. And they knew that. That's why that was the task. So when you talk about these modes of sexualization, it's a lot deeper than even we give credit for. For Monday, for Monday's class, we'll discuss the Pan-African connection. talking about Marcus Garvey and Carter G. Woodson. So please come with that read on Monday. There will be no class on Wednesday.